Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're talking about something that's going to make you furious. So go ahead and get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let me tell you about a woman who gave a king exactly what he wanted and got thrown away like garbage the second she did. This is about Bessie Blount, and I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to want to scream. Before we start, if you're into these stories about women history tried to bury, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe if you want more, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's here in the dark with me. All right, let's get into it. In 1519, a teenage girl gave birth to a baby boy. Healthy, perfect, everything a king could want. The father, Henry VIII of England. The baby, acknowledged, titled, celebrated as the king's first living son. The mother, married off to a stranger, within months, banned from court, her name barely whispered again. And the boy, he'd grow up knowing his father was king, but never being allowed anywhere near the throne. He'd die at 17, possibly murdered, and his death would be hushed up so fast it's still suspicious 500 years later. But here's what really happened, the part they don't teach you in school. What they did to Bessie Blount is going to show you something most history books won't admit. That even when women gave kings exactly what they needed, they were still disposable. That your womb could be your greatest asset and your fastest ticket to oblivion. And that Tudor England, for all its velvet gowns and golden goblets, was a nightmare wearing a crown. So let's talk about Bessie, because she deserves better than being a footnote in Henry VIII's horror show of a love life. And trust me, this gets worse before it gets worse. Imagine being born in 1498 in rural England, Shropshire probably. Green hills, sheep, not much else. You're a girl, strike one. You're from minor gentry, respectable but not rich, not royal. Just enough status to get your foot in the door if you're pretty and you play your cards right. Strike two. And your entire future, your whole life, everything you'll ever be or do, it boils down to three options. Option one, marry someone your father picks, some minor nobleman twice your age who needs an heir, and doesn't much care what you think about anything. Option two, lock yourself in a convent, pray 6 times a day, never speak above a whisper, die a virgin with knees calloused from kneeling on cold stone. Option three, become a lady-in-waiting at court, dance at banquets, smile prettily, hope some nobleman wants to marry you before your teeth fall out and your face loses its value. That's it. Those are your choices. Bessie Blount got option three, or more accurately, her family shoved her toward it. Because here's what nobody tells you about being minor gentry in Tudor England. You're desperate. You have a title, sure. You have land, maybe, but you're one bad harvest, one expensive lawsuit, one royal disfavour away from losing everything. So when you have a daughter who's pretty, who can dance, sing, charm people, you send her to court, you dress her up, teach her how to curtsy without falling over, and you throw her into the snake pit and pray she catches someone important's eye. And if that someone happens to be the king, well, you try not to think too hard about what that means. Bessie arrived at Henry VIII's court around 1512, maybe 15 and 13. She was maybe 14, maybe 15, a child by any sane standard. She was appointed as a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. The Spanish princess who'd been married off to Henry's older brother Arthur first watched him die, and then been recycled to the spare heir because nobody wanted to give back her massive dowry. Bessie's job description was simple. Look pretty, don't speak unless spoken to, attend the Queen, dance at banquets, embroider things no one will ever use, giggle at the right moments, lower your eyes at the right moments, and for the love of God, stay virginal. That last part was critical. Maids of honour were supposed to be pure, untouched, walking symbols of feminine virtue and piety. They were basically very expensive props in uncomfortable dresses. But here's what they don't tell you about Tudor court. Underneath all that velvet and gold, all those elaborate dances and polite conversations, it was a hunting ground. a meat market with music. And the girls, the young, pretty, powerless girls, they were the prey. Bessie Blount was exactly the kind of girl who got hunted. She was young. That was valuable. Youth meant fertility, meant you probably hadn't been damaged yet, meant you could be moulded, controlled, used. She was beautiful, by all accounts. We don't have portraits of her, of course we don't. She wasn't important enough. But every contemporary source mentions her looks, her grace, the way men looked at her. And she could dance. Not just shuffle around in a dress, but really dance. The kind of dancing that made people stop talking and watch. Fluid, sensual, hypnotic. She could sing. Clear voice, perfect pitch. Could perform in those elaborate masks the Tudors loved. Those theatrical productions where everyone wore masks and pretended to be Greek gods, while getting absolutely wrecked on spiced wine and feeling each other up in dark corners. She had charm, wit, the kind of intelligence you had to hide but could deploy strategically, and she had the kind of beauty that made powerful men take notice. One man in particular, Henry VIII, the king himself. Now pause, because you need to understand who Henry was at this point. Because he wasn't the bloated, paranoid, leg ulcer oozing monster you're probably picturing. That comes later. This was young Henry, golden boy Henry, the prince every kingdom in Europe wanted to marry off their daughters to. He was 6'2", massive for the era, athletic, could joust, hunt, dance for hours without breaking a sweat. He composed music, wrote poetry, spoke Latin, French, Spanish, could debate theology with scholars and hold his own. He was handsome, broad shoulders, muscular legs, red gold hair, that Tudor magnetism that made people want to please him. He was everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be. He was also already married to Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine, after years of trying, years of pregnancies that ended in blood-soaked sheets and tiny coffins, had exactly one living child, Princess Mary, a girl. No sons, no male heir, and no sign that Catherine would ever produce one. In Tudor England, that wasn't just disappointing, it was catastrophic, apocalyptic, the kind of problem that could tear a kingdom apart. Because the Wars of the Roses had only ended in 1485, just 27 years before Bessie arrived at court. The memory of civil war was still fresh, still terrifying. Rival claimants fighting over the throne, armies in the streets, executions, chaos. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile, built on battlefield victory, not ancient bloodlines. Without a male heir, England could collapse into war again. The dynasty could end before it even solidified. So Henry prayed, went on pilgrimages, consulted astrologers, made offerings to saints, and he blamed Catherine. Because of course he did. Everyone assumed it was the woman's fault when there were no sons. Biology wasn't understood. Medicine was guesswork wrapped in prayer. And nobody was going to suggest that maybe the problem was the king's seed. So Catherine carried the weight of it. The guilt, the shame, the terror of knowing that if she didn't produce a son, she could lose everything. But while Henry waited for Catherine to miraculously pop out a male heir, he wasn't exactly practicing celibacy. He had mistresses, several of them, and Bessie Blount was about to become one of the most important. We don't know exactly when it started. History isn't great at recording the moment a king decides to fuck a teenage girl who works for his wife. Probably 1514, maybe 1515. Bessie would have been 16, maybe 17 at most. Henry was in his early 20s. And yes, by modern standards, that's horrifying. That's a grown man pursuing a child. That's an employer with absolute power targeting a subordinate who can't say no. But in Tudor terms, 16 was marriageable, fuckable, fair game. Girls were considered women the moment they started menstruating. And once you were a woman, you were expected to understand how the world worked. You were expected to know that when the king wanted you, you didn't refuse. Because refusing wasn't just socially impossible, it was dangerous. Let me paint you a picture of what could happen if a girl said no to the king. Your family's position at court? Gone overnight. Your father's lands? Could be seized for some invented reason. Your brother's careers? Destroyed. Your sister's marriage prospects? Ruined by association. And you'd be sent away from court in disgrace. Your reputation would be destroyed. You'd be unmarriageable, because who wants the girl who rejected the king? You'd spend the rest of your life in some remote manor house, watching your family's fortunes crumble, knowing it was your fault. Or worse, because kings had ways of dealing with people who embarrassed them. Tower of London, charges of treason, a quick execution, and a grave nobody would mark. It didn't happen often, didn't need to. The threat was enough. So when the king pursued you, you smiled. You flirted back. You went along with it, and you prayed you'd survive. Because here's the other thing they don't tell you. Once you became the king's lover, you were marked, ruined, used goods. Even if you left with money, titles, a pension, even if the king was generous, you were damaged. Most noblemen wouldn't touch you. You were the king's leftovers, and that meant something. You'd spent time in the royal bed. Your body had been used by the highest authority in the land. And now you were, what? Secondhand? Soiled? The same sexual experience that made a man worldly and experienced made a woman worthless. But some families encouraged it anyway, pushed their daughters toward the king's attention. Because if she played it right, if she kept him happy, if she was discreet and clever and lucky, the entire family could benefit. Lands, titles, positions at court, marriages for her brothers, dowries for her sisters. One girl's body could lift an entire family's fortunes. Bessie's family probably knew, probably encouraged it. Her father, John Blount, held positions at court. He would have known how the game was played. Did he push Bessie toward Henry? Did he turn a blind eye when the king started paying her attention? Did he calculate the benefits and decide his daughter's virtue was worth less than the family's advancement? We don't know, because nobody asked Bessie. Nobody recorded her feelings, her fears, her thoughts. Like most women in history, she's been reduced to a body, a womb, a scandal. But here's what we do know. Bessie became Henry's mistress sometime around 1514 or 1515. Their affair lasted several years, and she was smart about it. She was discreet, quiet, didn't make scenes, didn't demand things, didn't embarrass the queen in public. Because mistresses who caused trouble, who got jealous, who made demands, who drew too much attention, they didn't last long. The king would lose interest. You'd be married off to someone unimportant in the countryside, or you'd just disappear, sent to a convent, exiled to your family's most remote estate, gone. Bessie understood the game. Smile in private, stay invisible in public, give him what he wants, don't get attached, don't get pregnant if you can help it. And for a few years, it worked. She danced at masques with the king, laughed at his jokes, let him write her terrible poetry, probably slept with him in whatever private chambers could be found, because royal affairs required logistics, timing, servants who could be bribed or threatened into silence. She attended Queen Catherine during the day, helped her dress, attended her at meals, embroidered with her, knowing that at night she might be summoned to the king's chambers. Imagine that, spending your days with the woman whose husband you're sleeping with, looking her in the eye, helping her put on her jewels, listening to her pray for a son, knowing you're part of her humiliation. That's not romantic, that's psychological torture, but you don't get to say no. You don't get to feel guilty. You don't get to have feelings about it at all. You just do what you're told and hope you survive. And then, in late 1518 or early 1519, Bessie missed her period. Oh fuck, let's talk about what that moment must have felt like. Because pregnancy in Tudor England wasn't an Instagram announcement with a cute photo and lots of heart emojis. It was terror. First you realise you're late, maybe a week, maybe two, and you're hoping, praying it's just stress. Just your body being weird. Just anything except what you know it probably is. You can't take a test, Can't pee on a stick and get a clear answer. You just wait. Watch for other signs. Are your breasts tender? Are you nauseous in the mornings? Are you crying at random things, feeling exhausted, noticing strange cravings? And then you wait longer. Another week, another 2 weeks, and then you know, you're pregnant with the king's child, and your life as you knew it is over. Because pregnancy meant visibility. It meant scandal. It meant Queen Catherine would know for certain that her husband was not only unfaithful, but fertile. That distinction mattered. Infidelity was expected. Kings had mistresses. Everyone knew it. Catherine probably suspected it. But fertility? If Bessie could carry a child to term, that meant the problem wasn't Henry's seed, it was Catherine's womb. That realization would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life, would eventually lead to her divorce, her exile, her death alone in a cold castle, separated from her daughter, declared illegitimate and unloved. But for Bessie, pregnancy meant something more immediate. It meant she was about to face the most dangerous thing a woman could do in Tudor England. Childbirth. Let me give you the numbers because you need to understand how bad this was. Roughly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. 1 in 3. That's not ancient history levels of bad. That's Russian roulette with extra bullets. Think about it. Get pregnant today, and you have a 33% chance of dying in the next year. Not from war, not from disease, from the natural, biological process of reproduction. Your body doing what it's supposedly designed to do could kill you. And there was nothing that could save you if something went wrong. No hospitals, no doctors, who actually knew what the fuck they were doing. No anesthesia to manage the pain. No understanding of hygiene, infection, or basic anatomy. No blood transfusions if you bled out. No emergency C-sections you could survive. They only did those when the mother was already dead or dying to try to save the baby. No antibiotics if you got an infection afterward. No way to stop puerperal fever, childbed fever, that rotting infection that killed so many women in the days and weeks after birth. If something went wrong during labour, if the baby was breech, if you tore badly, if the placenta didn't deliver, if you hemorrhaged, you just died, screaming, bleeding out, begging for it to stop, and things went wrong a lot. So when Bessie realised she was pregnant with the king's child, she wasn't just facing scandal or political consequences. She was facing a very real possibility that she'd die screaming on a blood-soaked mattress, while some midwife muttered prayers and pressed herbs against her torn flesh. And even if she survived the birth, the baby might not. Infant mortality was brutal. Around 30–40% of babies died before age 5. Many died within hours or days of birth. So you could go through all that pain, all that terror, all that risk, and still end up with a tiny corpse and empty arms. This was the reality Bessie was facing, and she had to face it in secret. Henry couldn't afford a public spectacle. The king's mistress, obviously pregnant, attending the queen at court. Unthinkable. So Bessie was quietly removed, sent away to some private residence far from London, far from prying eyes, far from the queen's suspicious glare and the court gossips who'd turned this into the scandal of the decade. Some accounts say she went to a monastery in Essex. Others suggest a private manor house. We don't know for sure because, surprise, nobody thought the details of where the king's pregnant mistress was stashed mattered enough to record carefully. What we do know is that she was alone, or as alone as someone in her position could be. She'd be attended by servants, obviously, midwives, maybe a physician, though they were usually useless, people who'd been paid well and threatened thoroughly to keep their mouths shut. But her family? Probably not there. Henry wouldn't want anyone around who might gossip or make demands. Her friends from court? Gone. She'd been removed from that world entirely. The king himself? He wasn't going to visit a pregnant mistress. That would be scandalous, improper. He'd sent her away to avoid scandal. He wasn't about to create more by showing up at her door. So Bessie spent those months in isolation, watching her body change, feeling the baby move inside her, knowing that with every day that passed, she was getting closer to the most dangerous moment of her life. We don't know how she felt during those months. Terrified? Almost certainly. Resigned? Probably. Hopeful that the baby might actually secure her future? Maybe. Though, if she was smart, and she was, she knew better. Angry at the king who'd gotten her into this, at her family who'd pushed her toward this, at the whole fucking system that treated women's bodies like commodities? We'll never know, because nobody asked her, nobody recorded her voice. All we know is this. In the summer of 1519, probably late June or early July, Bessie Blount went into labour, and what happened next was going to change everything. Let me tell you what childbirth actually looked like in Tudor England. Not the sanitised version, the real version, because you need to understand what Bessie went through. First, you're isolated, put in a birthing chamber that's been prepared according to tradition. The windows are closed, covered with heavy curtains or shuttered completely, because fresh air was thought to be dangerous during childbirth, likely to let in diseases or evil spirits or some other nonsense. So the room is hot, stuffy, dark. The air is thick and humid, smells like sweat and fear, and the herbs they're burning, lavender, maybe rosemary, to purify the space and mask the other smells that are coming. You're surrounded by women, midwives, female relatives if you're lucky, servants, sometimes a gossip, a woman whose job is literally just to be there and support you emotionally, though the word gossip tells you how much that role was valued. No men allowed. Men couldn't be present at births. It was considered improper. Even physicians rarely attended births unless something went horribly wrong, and by then it was usually too late. So you're in a room full of women, most of whom have watched other women give birth, but none of whom are trained in anything resembling modern medicine. They know folk remedies, old wives' tales, prayer, that's it. You're in a birthing chair, basically a wooden seat with a hole cut in it and handles on the sides for you to grip. Or maybe you're on a bed, lying in straw that's going to be soaked with blood, and worse by the end of this. Some women gave birth standing, some squatting, some on their hands and knees. Whatever position the midwife thought was best, that's what you did, and then the pain starts. Not like period cramps, not like anything you've ever felt before. Your body is being torn apart from the inside. Muscles you didn't know you had are contracting, squeezing, trying to push something the size of a watermelon through an opening the size of a lemon. And there's nothing to manage the pain. No epidural, no gas and air, no morphine. Some women were given strong ale or wine to drink, maybe some herbal concoction that did absolutely nothing except make you drowsy. But mostly, you just suffered through it. And you scream. Everyone screams during childbirth. There's no shame in it because there's no other option. The pain is so intense, so all-consuming that your body just screams involuntarily. Like your nervous system is trying to alert the world that something is very, very wrong. The midwives are around you, telling you to push, checking your dilation with their hands. No gloves, no sanitizer, just hands that have been, God knows where, touching you in your most vulnerable moment. They're pressing on your belly, trying to help the baby move down. Sometimes they'd reach inside and try to turn the baby if it was positioned wrong. Excruciating, dangerous, often making things worse. Hours pass, maybe a full day, maybe longer. First labours especially could take a long time. 24 hours, 36 hours, sometimes more, and the whole time you're in agony. Exhausted, you've lost track of time, can't think straight, can't remember why you're doing this or what's supposed to happen next. You're sweating, shaking, maybe vomiting from the pain and the fear and the exertion, and then you feel something rip. Your perineum, the area between your vagina and your anus, tears. Because it can't stretch fast enough. Because babies' heads are huge relative to the opening they have to come through. Most women tore during childbirth. Some tears were small, Some were catastrophic, extending all the way through to the anus, leaving you incontinent and in agony for weeks or months afterward. And there's blood, so much blood, gushing out with every contraction, pooling beneath you, soaking the straw or the sheets or whatever you're kneeling on. Normal childbirth involves losing about a pint of blood, maybe more, and you can lose a lot more than that without dying, though you will be weak, dizzy, anemic for weeks afterward. But some women hemorrhage, lose too much blood too fast, and then you're dying. Right there, in front of everyone. And there's nothing anyone can do except watch and pray, and maybe try to stanch the bleeding with cloths that probably aren't clean. The midwives are shouting instructions, maybe arguing with each other about what to do, praying loudly, calling on saints for help. And you're pushing until you think your spine will crack, until you feel your pelvis separating, because it does slightly, to let the baby through, until you're certain you're going to die, that this pain will never end, that you've made a terrible mistake, and there's no way out now except through, and then finally the baby comes. The head first, usually. That's the worst part, crowning they call it. The moment when the baby's head is stretching you to your absolute limit, and you feel like you're going to split in half. The midwives might tell you to stop pushing then, to let the head come slowly, to give your body time to stretch, or they might tell you to push harder, to get it over with, and then the head is out, and the shoulders, more pain, more tearing, more blood, and then the rest of the baby slips out in a rush of fluid and blood and tissue, and you hear it, a cry, high-pitched, outraged at being forced out of its warm, dark home into the cold, bright world. A boy, healthy, screaming, perfect. The king's son, and for just a moment, just one moment, you feel relief. Not happiness, not joy, just relief. You survived. The baby survived. It's over. But it's not over. The midwives are still working, because now they have to deliver the placenta, the afterbirth. Another few minutes of contractions, though nothing like what you just went through. And they have to check you for tears, clean you up, stanch the bleeding if it's bad, and you're lying there, exhausted, shaking in pain, while they handle your body like it's a piece of meat, washing you, checking you, stitching you if the tear is bad, though without anaesthesia that's its own special hell. Some women went into shock afterward. Some developed fevers, puerperal fever, the infection that killed so many new mothers. Some bled internally. Some had pieces of placenta left inside that would rot and poison them. Some just died, right there, after the baby was born. Bled out, went into shock, stopped breathing. Bessie didn't die. Against the odds, against the blood loss, against the pain and the terror and the very real possibility that this would kill her, she survived. She gave Henry VIII exactly what he wanted, a living, breathing, healthy baby boy. His first. The baby was named Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy literally means son of the king. It was the standard title given to royal bastards, an acknowledgement that yes, this child is mine, but no, he's not legitimate. He has no claim to the throne. And Henry VIII was thrilled, overjoyed, triumphant. He threw celebrations, showered the baby with gifts, with attention, with everything a prince could want. Because this baby proved something crucial. Henry could father sons. His seed was fine. The problem was Catherine. Fitzroy was living proof that Catherine was the one failing, that she was the reason there was no male heir, and that realization would doom Catherine's marriage, her status, her entire future. But Bessie, the woman who'd just risked her life, who'd been torn open and bled all over a birthing chair to give Henry this gift, she got disposed of. Within months of giving birth, some sources say weeks, Bessie Blount was married off. Not to someone she loved, not to someone she chose, not even to someone particularly notable, but to Gilbert Taleboys, a minor nobleman from Lincolnshire, a man she'd probably never met before the arrangements were made, a man chosen because he was respectable, loyal to the crown, and willing to overlook Bessie's past in exchange for royal favour. This was Henry's reward for her: a pension, some gifts, a respectable marriage that would make her someone else's problem. In Tudor terms, she was being taken care of, provided for, set up for a comfortable life. But let's call it what it actually was: exile. Her son would stay with the king, would be raised in palaces, educated by the finest tutors, groomed for greatness. And Bessie? She'd be sent to the countryside, expected to shut up, play the role of dutiful wife to a stranger, and never mention her past again. She had no say in this, no choice, no voice. Think about that. You've just given birth. Your body is still healing, still bleeding, still in pain, still recovering from the trauma of being ripped open. And within weeks, maybe even days, someone comes and takes your baby. Not asks, not discusses, just takes, and then tells you you're getting married. To someone you don't know, someone you didn't choose. And you're expected to be grateful. Because look, you're getting a husband, a pension, a comfortable life in the countryside. Never mind that you just gave the king exactly what he wanted. Never mind that you risked your life. Never mind that you're losing your son. You should be grateful. And Bessie, smart enough to know how the game worked, probably was grateful. Or at least knew better than to complain. Because women who complained, who made demands, who caused problems, they disappeared. So Bessie went quietly, married Gilbert Taleboys, moved to his estate in Lincolnshire, about 120 miles north of London. Might as well have been another country. And she started a new life. Meanwhile, Henry Fitzroy stayed with the king, was given his own household, his own servants, was bathed and dressed and fed and educated by people who weren't his mother. At age 6, he'd be made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Earl of Nottingham. Given lands, estates, an income that rivaled European princes. For all intents and purposes, he was being raised as the heir to the throne. And Bessie? She faded into the background. Had more children with Gilbert Taleboys, 3 of them. 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Anne, and a son, George. She managed estates, raised her children, played the role of dutiful country wife, and the history books barely mention her after 1519. That's the point. This isn't just one woman's tragedy. It's a system, a machine designed to extract what it needed from women's bodies and then discard them the moment they stopped being useful. Bessie wasn't a villain. She wasn't a schemer. She didn't seduce the king and trap him with a pregnancy. She was a teenage girl who caught the king's eye, did what was expected of her, gave him the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world, and was thrown away for it. And this was considered generous, normal, kind even, because in Tudor England, women weren't people. They were commodities, breeding stock, political tools, and if you survived being used, you were supposed to be grateful. But here's what really kills me about Bessie's story. She was one of the lucky ones. I know, that sounds insane, but stick with me. Let me show you what happened to the other women in Henry VIII's life. Because once you see the pattern, once you understand how disposable women were, you'll understand why lucky is such a low fucking bar. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, the Spanish princess. She was married to Henry for over 20 years. 20 years of trying to give him a son. 20 years of hope and heartbreak and tiny coffins. She was pregnant at least 6 times. Probably more. Early miscarriages weren't always recorded. January 1510. Miscarried a daughter. January 1511. Gave birth to a son, Henry. He lived 52 days and then died. Catherine was devastated. September 1513. Gave birth to a son. He was either stillborn or died almost immediately. November 1514. Gave birth to another son. Also either stillborn or died immediately. February 1516 gave birth to Princess Mary. Finally, a living child, but a girl, not good enough. November 1518 gave birth to another daughter. The baby either was stillborn or died within hours. 6 pregnancies. 6 times Catherine's body went through the trauma of pregnancy and childbirth. 6 times she hoped this would be the one. 6 times she endured the pain and the fear and the risk of death. And out of all that suffering, only one child survived. Mary. A girl, not enough, not what the king needed. So what happened to Catherine? Henry cast her aside. He didn't just divorce her, he humiliated her. He declared their marriage invalid, declared that they'd never been truly married because she'd been married to his brother first, and that violated some obscure biblical passage he suddenly cared about. He separated her from her daughter, forbade them from seeing each other. Mary was declared illegitimate, a bastard, stripped of her title as princess. Catherine was exiled to drafty, remote castles, stripped of her title. She was no longer queen, just Princess Dowager, the widow of Arthur, Henry's dead brother. She died in January 1536, alone, sick, probably from cancer, in a cold, miserable castle called Kimbolton. She was 50 years old. She'd spent 24 years married to Henry, had endured multiple pregnancies, miscarriages, and the loss of several infants, had been a loyal, dignified, pious queen, and she died alone, separated from her daughter, declared illegitimate and unwanted. That's what happened to a queen who failed to produce a son. Now let's talk about Anne Boleyn. Anne was the woman Henry broke with Rome to marry, the woman he defied the Pope for, the woman he risked civil war for. Henry split the English Church from the Catholic Church, created the English Reformation, dissolved the monasteries, executed people who opposed him, all so he could divorce Catherine and marry Anne. That's how desperately he wanted her. They married in January 1533. Anne was already pregnant. In September 1533, she gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth, not a son, not what Henry wanted. Anne got pregnant again, miscarried in summer 1534, pregnant again, miscarried in January 1536, a boy, some sources say. And that was it. 3 pregnancies in less than 3 years. 1 living daughter, no sons. Henry lost interest, started pursuing other women, started looking for a way out. And in May 1536, Anne was arrested, charged with adultery, incest, treason, plotting to kill the king. All of it was bullshit, made up. The evidence was ridiculous, confessions extracted under torture, vague statements twisted into accusations. But it didn't matter. Henry wanted her gone. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded. She was 35 years old, maybe younger. We're not sure of her birth date. She'd been queen for 3 years, married for 3 years, and now she was dead. Her daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, a bastard, stripped of her title. Henry moved on, married Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, 11 days later. That's what happened to a queen who failed to produce a son. Jane Seymour was the 3rd wife, and she was the only one who gave Henry what he wanted. She got pregnant in late 1536, and in October 1537, after a long, difficult labour, she gave birth to a boy, Edward, a living, breathing, legitimate male heir. Finally, Henry was ecstatic, threw celebrations, gave thanks to God, showered Jane with gifts and praise. She was the perfect queen, the true wife, the one who'd succeeded where the others had failed. 12 days later, Jane died. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, infection. Her body, torn apart by childbirth, had gotten infected. Bacteria had invaded her uterus, her bloodstream, and without antibiotics, without any real medical intervention, the infection killed her. She died on October 24, 1537. She was 28 years old. Henry mourned her, called her his true wife, the one he really loved. When he died 11 years later, he was buried next to her. But let's be real. Henry mourned her because she gave him a son and then died before she could disappoint him. She was frozen in his mind as the perfect wife, because she didn't live long enough to fail. That's what happened to the queen who succeeded. Anne of Cleves was next, the fourth wife, the Flanders mare as Henry supposedly called her. She arrived in England in January 1540 for an arranged marriage. Henry had seen her portrait, painted by Hans Holbein, and thought she looked attractive. When he met her in person, he was disgusted. She wasn't attractive enough for him, didn't speak English well, wasn't flirtatious or charming. He went through with the marriage anyway, had to, politically, but 6 months later, he annulled it, declared the marriage had never been consummated, got Parliament to dissolve it. Anne was smart, she didn't fight it, accepted the annulment, agreed to everything, and because of that, she survived. She was given estates, a generous income, and allowed to live comfortably in England for the rest of her life. She outlived Henry and all his other wives. She died in 1557 at age 41, of natural causes peacefully in her own bed. That's what happened when you didn't fight back, when you accepted what the king wanted and didn't make trouble. Catherine Howard was the fifth wife, and she was a child. She was maybe 17, maybe younger, when Henry married her in July 1540. Henry was 49, obese, covered in festering leg ulcers that smelled like rot, paranoid, volatile, and Catherine was a teenager who'd probably been sexually abused as a child by her music teacher, Francis Derham, who'd had a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a member of Henry's privy chamber. Whether she continued those relationships after marrying Henry, whether she actually committed adultery or was just young and reckless and stupid, it didn't matter. In November 1541, evidence of her past came out, maybe her present too. She was arrested, interrogated, accused of adultery and treason. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded. She was maybe 19, maybe 20, maybe younger. We don't know her exact birth date. She'd been queen for a year and a half. That's what happened to a girl who couldn't navigate the impossible game of being Henry VIII's wife. Catherine Parr was the last wife, and she survived only because Henry died first. She married Henry in July 1543. She was 31. Henry was 52. She was intelligent, educated, politically savvy, and she knew how to handle Henry's moods, his paranoia, his rages, but even she lived in constant fear. In 1546, conservatives at court tried to have her arrested for heresy. She had Protestant sympathies, was reading banned books, discussing theology. She barely escaped arrest, had to grovel to Henry, downplay her intelligence, claim she'd only been trying to learn from him. Henry let it go. She survived, but only because she knew when to submit, when to play dumb, when to be exactly what Henry needed her to be. Henry died in January 1547. Catherine outlived him by just over a year. She remarried quickly to Thomas Seymour, got pregnant, gave birth to a daughter in August 1548, and died 6 days later, from puerperal fever. She was 36 years old. Even surviving Henry VIII didn't save her from the thing that killed so many women: childbirth. This is the world Bessie Blount lived in, a world where queens could be beheaded, where wives could be discarded like used napkins, where women's lives were worth less than their ability to produce sons. And Bessie wasn't even a queen. She was a mistress, expendable, replaceable, disposable. The fact that she survived at all, that she got a pension and a husband and a quiet life instead of being murdered or dying in childbirth or just disappearing, meant she was lucky. But lucky shouldn't mean didn't get executed. That's how fucked up this system was. Now let's talk about what Bessie's life actually looked like after she was married off. Because even though the historical record is sparse, we can piece together what her daily reality must have been. She was married to Gilbert Taleboys in late 1519 or early 1520, moved to his estate in South Kime, Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire is flat, marshy, cold in winter, muggy in summer, a long way from the glittering court life of London. Gilbert was fine, probably, not cruel, not particularly exciting, Just a minor nobleman doing minor nobleman things, managing estates, collecting rents, settling disputes between tenants. Bessie's job was clear. Be a wife, manage the household, produce children, stay quiet about her past, and she did all of that. She had 3 children with Gilbert, 2 daughters, Elizabeth, born around 1520 or 1521, and Anne, born a few years later, and a son, George, born around 1526. She would have spent her days running the household, managing servants, hiring, firing, making sure they weren't stealing too much, overseeing the kitchen, planning meals, checking supplies, making sure there was enough food for the household and guests. She'd attend church regularly, every Sunday, probably more. Pray, confess her sins, though she probably couldn't confess the real ones. She'd do needlework, supervise her daughter's education, teaching them to read, to manage a household, to be the kind of wife some nobleman would want. She'd attend social events, dinners with neighbouring families, local celebrations, playing the role of respectable gentry wife. On the surface, it probably looked fine, normal, boring even. But imagine what was going through her mind. Every time she held her daughters, did she think of the son she'd been forced to give up? Every time she played with George, watched him grow, taught him things, did she wonder what Fitzroy was doing? Whether he was happy, whether he ever thought of her? Every time she heard news from court, and she would have heard news, gossip travelled, did her heart stop? Did she listen desperately for mentions of Fitzroy? Every time someone whispered about her past, speculated about her time at court, made knowing remarks, did she want to scream? To defend herself? To tell her side of the story? Or had she learned to bury it all so deep that she could pretend it never happened? We don't know, because nobody asked her. Nobody recorded her voice. All we know is she played the role. Dutiful wife, respectable lady, mother to her children, and she stayed silent about the son she'd lost. Gilbert Taleboys died in 1530. Bessie was in her early 30s, still young, still attractive, probably, and she was a widow with a pension from the king. That made her a decent catch. Within a year or so, she married again. This time to Edward Clinton, Baron Clinton. This was actually a step up. Clinton was wealthier than Taleboys, better connected, more powerful. He'd go on to become one of the most important military leaders in England. Lord High Admiral under Edward VI, Mary Wyatt and Elizabeth III. He survived multiple regimes, multiple political upheavals. He was a survivor, a political operator. Some historians believe Henry VIII arranged this second marriage, that even years after their affair had ended, the king still felt some obligation to ensure Bessie was taken care of. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure she stayed quiet, stayed comfortable, enough not to cause trouble, not to write a memoir or start talking to people who might cause problems. Either way, Bessie's second marriage was definitely an upgrade. But once again, she wasn't choosing her own life. She was being managed. Someone, maybe Henry, maybe Clinton himself, decided she'd be a good match, and she went along with it, because what choice did she have? And once again, she adapted, played the role, survived. Let's talk about Henry Fitzroy's childhood, because understanding what he got helps us understand what Bessie lost. From birth, Fitzroy was special. He wasn't raised in some minor noble's household. He was raised like a prince. He had his own household, his own council, his own servants, dozens of them. Gentlemen ushers, chamberlains, tutors, musicians, physicians. He had income from vast estates, thousands of pounds per year, more than some European princes. He was given the best education money could buy. He had tutors in Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Spanish. He studied theology, philosophy, history, mathematics. He learned to hunt, joust, fence. He learned music, dancing, courtly manners. He was surrounded by some of the finest scholars in England, people like Richard Croke, a renowned humanist scholar, John Palsgrave, who wrote one of the first French grammar books in English, George Cotton, who later became Bishop of Chester. His household was modelled directly on a prince's household. Everything about his upbringing screamed, "This boy matters. This boy is important. This boy might be king someday." And through all of this, through his entire childhood, his education, his life, there's no mention of Bessie. No letters between mother and son. No visits. No acknowledgement that she even existed. Fitzroy's identity was entirely built around being the king's son. His mother had been surgically removed from the narrative. This was intentional, deliberate. Henry wanted Fitzroy to think of himself as royal, not as the illegitimate son of a discarded mistress. Any connection to Bessie would have undermined that image. It would have reminded everyone that Fitzroy was a bastard. Born of sin, born of an affair, better to just erase the mother entirely. And it worked. Fitzroy grew up thinking of himself as the king's son. That was his identity. That was everything that mattered. Did he ever ask about his mother? Did he wonder who she was, where she was? We don't know. There's no record of it. Maybe he was told she was dead. Maybe he was told she was nobody important. Maybe he just never asked because nobody around him ever mentioned her. But imagine being that child, growing up knowing your father is the king, but your mother is, what? A blank space, an absence, something nobody talks about. That leaves a mark. And imagine being Bessie, knowing your son is alive, knowing he's being raised in luxury, knowing he's learning, growing, becoming someone, and knowing you'll never be part of it. You'll never teach him anything, never comfort him when he's scared, never celebrate his accomplishments, never just be his mother. He's out there, alive, thriving, but he's not yours. He never was. He was the king's from the moment he was born, and you have to live with that every single day. In 1525, when Fitzroy was 6 years old, Henry decided to make his position official. On June 18, 1525, in a grand ceremony at Bridewell Palace, 6-year-old Henry Fitzroy was elevated to the peerage. He was made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Earl of Nottingham, Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honours in England. Richmond was particularly significant. It had been Henry VIII's title before he became king. Giving it to Fitzroy sent a clear message. This boy is important. This boy is special. This boy might be king someday. Fitzroy was also given enormous estates, lands in Yorkshire, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall, Lincolnshire, castles, manors, income from rents and taxes. He was wealthier than most adult nobles, and he was sent north to Yorkshire to essentially govern the north of England as Henry's representative. He had his own council, his own administrators. At age 6, he was holding court, dispensing justice, making decisions. Obviously, the adults around him were doing most of the actual work, but the point was symbolic. Fitzroy was being trained to rule. Foreign ambassadors noticed, sent reports back to their kings. The imperial ambassador wrote, "It looks as if the king meant to make him his heir." The Venetian ambassador speculated that Henry might legitimise Fitzroy through an act of parliament. Everyone could see what was happening. Henry was grooming his bastard son as a backup heir, as insurance in case Catherine never produced a son. But there was a problem, a big one. Legitimacy mattered. In Tudor England, it mattered desperately. The whole system, the monarchy, the succession, the social hierarchy, was built on legitimacy, on bloodlines and marriage, and the idea that you were born into your position. Bastards had no legal rights. They couldn't inherit titles or property unless specifically legitimised. And legitimising a bastard, especially a king's bastard, was politically explosive. It would mean admitting that Henry's marriage to Catherine was doomed, that there would never be a legitimate male heir, that England's future rested on a boy born out of wedlock. It would also mean dealing with Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter, the legitimate heir, or at least she was legitimate as long as Henry's marriage to Catherine was considered valid. If Henry legitimised Fitzroy and made him heir, what happened to Mary? Was she just bumped down, declared illegitimate, married off to some foreign prince and forgotten? This was a political nightmare, and Henry knew it. So he danced around it, gave Fitzroy everything except the one thing that mattered: legitimacy. And Fitzroy grew up in this weird limbo, treated like a prince, living like a prince, but never quite secure, never quite certain. Because at any moment, if Henry's marriage situation changed, if Catherine died, if Henry got a male heir from someone else, Fitzroy's position could evaporate. He was valuable, but he was also vulnerable. And meanwhile, his mother was living quietly in Lincolnshire, married to Edward Clinton, raising her other children, watching from a distance as her first son was elevated to heights she could never reach. Did she attend the ceremony when Fitzroy was made a duke? Almost certainly not. That would have been awkward, scandalous. Did she even know about it before everyone else did? Or did she hear about it through gossip, through travellers, through whispered conversations? We don't know. All we know is that her son, the boy she'd nearly died giving birth to, was becoming one of the most important people in England, and she would never be acknowledged as his mother. Here's what I keep thinking about. Bessie was still alive during all of this, during Fitzroy's childhood, his elevation, his life in the north. She was maybe 120 miles away. Not that far, geographically, but it might as well have been another world. Did she ever see him, even from a distance? Maybe she travelled to London occasionally. Maybe she attended some court function, some wedding or feast. Maybe she caught a glimpse of him, this boy who was hers but wasn't. Did she see herself in his face? Did she recognise anything of her own features, her own mannerisms? Or had he been so thoroughly shaped by his royal upbringing that there was nothing of her left in him? We'll never know, but I think about it. I think about what it must have been like to be Bessie, to have given up your child and then spend years hearing about him, hearing how important he was, how successful, how valued, and knowing you could never claim him, never tell anyone the truth, never say, "That's my son, I gave birth to him, I'm his mother." You just had to smile, stay quiet, play your role. That's not just loss, that's torture. The political situation was getting messier. By the late 1520s, it was clear that Catherine of Aragon would never give Henry a son. She was in her 40s, well past childbearing age by Tudor standards. And Henry was getting desperate. He'd fallen for Anne Boleyn, was obsessed with her, wanted to marry her. So he started pursuing an annulment, arguing that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid because she'd been married to his brother Arthur first. The Pope refused. Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and he pressured the Pope to deny Henry's request. So Henry did something radical. He broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved the monasteries, created the English Reformation, all so he could divorce Catherine and marry Anne. This was 1533. Fitzroy was 14 years old, and suddenly his position was even more complicated. If Henry's marriage to Catherine was annulled, declared never valid, that meant Mary was illegitimate, a bastard no different from Fitzroy legally, which meant what? That Fitzroy could inherit? That he was next in line? Maybe, if Henry legitimised him. But Henry didn't. He kept Fitzroy in limbo. And then Anne got pregnant, gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533. Another daughter, another disappointment. Henry was running out of options. He had 3 children: Fitzroy, Mary, Elizabeth, 1 bastard son, 2 daughters, 1 legitimate, maybe, 1 definitely illegitimate. No clear heir. In 1533, to further solidify Fitzroy's position, Henry arranged a marriage for him. Fitzroy, age 14, was married to Mary Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This was pure politics. The Howards were one of the most powerful families in England. Marrying Fitzroy to Mary Howard tied Fitzroy to that power base. It also sent a message. Fitzroy is important. Fitzroy has a future, but the marriage was never consummated. Fitzroy and Mary were too young. They lived separately. It was a legal arrangement, not a relationship. And Bessie, still alive, still in Lincolnshire, still not part of her son's life. Did she know about the marriage? Did she hear about it through gossip? Did she wish she could have been there? Wish she could have met her son's wife? Wish she could have played any role at all in this milestone? We don't know. All we know is that she wasn't included, wasn't invited, wasn't mentioned. She'd been erased so thoroughly that even major events in her son's life happened without her. And then in 1536, everything changed. In January, Catherine of Aragon died. Finally, after years of exile, years of separation from her daughter, years of being declared illegitimate and unwanted, she was 50, probably had cancer, died alone and bitter. Henry threw a party, literally. He celebrated, wore yellow, paraded Elizabeth around. Finally, Catherine was gone. No longer a problem. In May, Anne Boleyn was arrested, charged with adultery, treason, incest. On May 19th, she was beheaded. Henry married Jane Seymour 11 days later, and Jane was pregnant by the end of the year. Fitzroy's position was suddenly precarious. If Jane gave birth to a legitimate son, Fitzroy's value would plummet. He'd go from potential heir to awkward reminder, from useful to inconvenient. And then, in July 1536, Henry Fitzroy died. He was 17 years old. Let me tell you about Fitzroy's death, because the more you look at it, the more suspicious it gets. The official cause was consumption, tuberculosis. And look, TB was common in Tudor England. It killed people of all ages. It's entirely possible that Fitzroy caught it, weakened, and died. But the timing. Catherine died in January 1536. Anne Boleyn was executed in May 1536. Jane Seymour was pregnant by late 1536, though she wouldn't give birth to Edward until October 1537. Fitzroy died on July 22nd, or 23, 1536, right in the middle of all this chaos, right when his position was most vulnerable, right when a legitimate heir was potentially on the way. Too convenient? Maybe. Rumours started almost immediately. Whispers that he'd been poisoned, that someone at court saw him as a threat and decided to eliminate the problem. Others said the stress killed him, that the uncertainty, the political manoeuvring, the knowledge that his entire position depended on Henry never having a legitimate son, it broke something inside him, made him vulnerable to disease. We'll never know the truth. What we do know is that Fitzroy's death was extremely convenient for certain people. With him gone, there was no question of a bastard challenging a legitimate heir. No awkward conversations about legitimizing him. No political complications. The succession was cleaner. And Henry VIII, the father who'd showered him with titles, who'd treated him like a prince, who'd groomed him for greatness, had his body buried quietly. In the middle of the night, with minimal ceremony, no grand funeral, no public mourning, no tomb befitting a Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Henry didn't even attend. Fitzroy's body was wrapped in lead and bundled into a wagon, transported secretly to Thetford Priory in Norfolk, about 100 miles northeast of London. Buried quickly, quietly, and then Henry issued orders. Nobody talks about this. This is not to become a public spectacle. Fitzroy was to be buried and forgotten. Even in death, he was a scandal to be managed. And Bessie? We don't know if she was told her son had died. We don't know if she was allowed to mourn him. She wasn't at the funeral, if you can even call it that. She wasn't mentioned in any accounts of his death. She'd been so thoroughly erased from his life that she was erased from his death too. Think about that. Your son dies, your firstborn, the child you nearly died giving birth to, and you might not even find out until weeks later, might hear it as gossip from a servant, might never get confirmation at all. You can't attend his funeral, can't see his body, can't say goodbye. You just have to Go on, keep living, keep playing the role of dutiful wife and mother to your other children, and never ever let anyone know how much it's destroying you inside, because you're not allowed to mourn publicly. You're not allowed to claim him as yours. He was the king's son, not yours, and now he's dead, and you have to live with that. With the knowledge that you lost him twice. Once when he was taken from you as a baby, and again when he died without you even being allowed to say goodbye. After Fitzroy's death, all his titles and property reverted to the crown. To Henry VIII. His widow, Mary Howard, got nothing. The marriage had never been consummated. They were too young, so she had no claim to his wealth. She was just another casualty in this whole mess. Mary was married off again in 1540 to Henry Scrope, 9th Baron Scrope of Bolton. Lived quietly, had children, died in 1557 at about age 42. Another woman whose life was shaped entirely by powerful men making decisions for her. And Bessie? She had no legal relationship to Fitzroy, no rights to his property, no acknowledgement that she was his mother. She got nothing. Not his wealth, not his titles, not even a fucking gravestone to visit. Her son was dead, and she was expected to just move on. Gilbert Taleboys had died in 1530, so Bessie was already married to Edward Clinton by the time Fitzroy died. Clinton was doing well, rising in the ranks. He'd become Lord High Admiral under Edward VI in 1550, was made Earl of Lincoln in 1572. Bessie, by all accounts, lived comfortably, had security, status. On the surface, everything was fine, but inside, I think she was devastated. I think losing Fitzroy, even though she'd never really had him, broke something in her that never healed. I think she carried that grief silently for the rest of her life, because that's what women did. They endured. They carried their pain quietly. They smiled and played their roles, and never let anyone see how much they were bleeding inside. Bessie died around 1540, 4 years after Fitzroy. She was in her early 40s. We don't know the cause of death, maybe illness, maybe childbirth complications, though there's no record of her having children with Clinton. Maybe just exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from a lifetime of trauma and loss. We don't know where she was buried. There's no grave marker, no monument, no memorial, just silence. The woman who gave Henry VIII his first living son vanished from history as thoroughly as if she'd never existed. So why does Bessie Blount's story matter? Because it's a reminder that history isn't just about kings and queens, battles and treaties, grand political events. It's also about the people crushed by those events, the people used, exploited, discarded, the people whose names don't make it into textbooks, but whose lives were just as real, just as important as anyone else's. Bessie gave the King of England exactly what he wanted: proof of his virility, a living son, political leverage, and her reward was erasure. She wasn't celebrated, wasn't honoured, wasn't even remembered properly. Until now, because we can choose to remember her. We can choose to tell her story. We can choose to honour her life, her pain, her resilience. We can refuse to let her be forgotten. Bessie Blount was a real person. She lived. She loved, or at least was forced to perform love. She gave birth. She raised children. She endured loss and pain and whatever small joys she could find. And she deserves to be remembered. Not as a footnote in Henry VIII's story, not as the king's mistress or Fitzroy's mother, but as a woman who mattered in her own right. A woman who was used by a system that valued her only for what she could provide, and then thrown away when she was no longer useful. Here's what history won't tell you. There were probably dozens of women like Bessie at Henry VIII's court, at every European court. Women who caught the king's eye, women who were used and discarded, women who bore children or didn't, women who were married off, or died or simply disappeared from the record. And we don't know most of their names, don't know their stories, because they weren't considered important enough to write down. Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister, was also Henry's mistress, probably bore him 2 children, though he never acknowledged them. She was married off quietly and died in obscurity. Jane Pollard, another maid of honour, was rumoured to have caught Henry's attention briefly. We know nothing else about her. There were probably others, women whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never recorded, who were used and erased and forgotten. History is full of these ghosts, these missing women, these erased lives, and every single one of them mattered. Every single one of them was a real person with thoughts, feelings, dreams, fears. Every single one of them deserved better than what they got. Bessie Blount is one of the few we know about, one of the few whose name survived. And that makes her story even more important, because if we forget her, if we let her remain a footnote, then all those other women are forgotten too. But if we remember her, if we tell her story, if we honour her life, then maybe we can start honouring all the other women whose names were erased, all the other women who were used, discarded, forgotten, all the other women who deserved better. Let me tell you what I think Bessie's final years were like. Because even though we don't have the details we can imagine, she was married to Edward Clinton, living comfortably. She had her other children, Elizabeth, Anne and George, from her first marriage. Maybe she was helping to raise Clinton's children from a previous marriage. She managed the household, attended social events, played the role of respectable lady. But inside, I think she was haunted. I think she thought about Fitzroy constantly, wondered what kind of man he'd been becoming, whether he'd been happy, whether he'd ever thought of her. I think when he died in 1536, she grieved silently, alone, with no one to talk to about it because no one acknowledged she was his mother. And I think that grief stayed with her, lived in her bones, followed her through every quiet dinner with Clinton, every social gathering, every mundane moment of her daily life. Because you don't just get over losing a child, especially when you lost that child twice, once when he was taken from you, and again when he died. I think she looked at her other children, especially George, her son with tail boys, and thought about Fitzroy, wondered what he would have been like if she'd been allowed to raise him. I think she attended church and prayed, maybe for Fitzroy's soul, maybe for her own, maybe just praying for the strength to keep going. And I think when she died around 1540, part of her was relieved. Not because life was unbearable, she'd survived, adapted, found whatever happiness she could, but because she was so tired, tired of carrying the weight of everything she'd lost, tired of pretending everything was fine, tired of being silent. And maybe, in whatever afterlife she believed in, she hoped she'd see him again. Her first son, the boy she'd been forced to give up. Maybe death was her way of finally going home to him. Here's what I want you to understand. The system that destroyed Bessie hasn't disappeared. It's evolved, changed shape, adapted to modern language and modern contexts. But women are still judged primarily by their bodies, still valued for their ability to fulfill certain roles, still punished when they don't conform. Women who are sexual are still called sluts. Women who get pregnant outside of marriage are still stigmatized. Women who demand recognition or power are still called ambitious in ways that aren't meant as compliments. Single mothers are still judged for raising children alone, even though often the fathers abandoned them or were never interested in parenting in the first place. Women who choose not to have children are still questioned, still treated like they're not complete women, still told they'll regret it. Women who have abortions are still criminalized in many places, still shamed, still treated like murderers for making choices about their own bodies. Women who are victims of sexual assault are still asked what they were wearing, whether they'd been drinking, whether they led him on. The language has changed, the underlying misogyny hasn't, and women's stories are still being erased, still being rewritten by people with power, still being dismissed as unimportant or irrelevant. But we can change that. We can tell these stories. We can honour these women. We can refuse to let them be forgotten. Bessie Blount didn't get to tell her own story. Her voice was silenced. Her experiences were interpreted by men with their own agendas. but we can tell her story now. And in doing so, we can make sure that she and the countless women like her are finally remembered. Not as footnotes, not as scandals, not as bodies that served a purpose, but as real people, with real lives, with real pain and real strength, and real stories that deserve to be told. So tonight, when you go to sleep in your comfortable bed, with choices about your own body and your own future, choices Bessie never had, remember her. Remember that she didn't have those choices, that her body was claimed by a king, that her son was taken from her, that her entire life was shaped by decisions made by powerful men who saw her as disposable. Remember that she survived it, endured it, lived through it, and raised other children, and found whatever happiness she could in a world that saw her as nothing more than a womb. And remember that we can do better. We can tell women's stories. We can honour women's lives. We can refuse to let women be erased. Bessie Blount gave birth to a king's son and was thrown away for it. But we don't have to throw her away again. We can remember her. We can tell her story. We can make sure she's never forgotten. Because every time we tell a forgotten woman's story, we're pushing back against the system that tried to erase her. Every time we honour women like Bessie, we're saying, you mattered. Your life mattered. Your pain and your strength and your survival. All of it mattered. And that's how we change things. Not by ignoring history's horrors, but by looking at them directly. By telling the truth about what happened. By making sure that women like Bessie Blount are finally remembered. Not as the king's discarded mistress, not as the mother who was erased, but as a woman who lived, who suffered, who endured, and who deserved so much better than what history gave her. So if you learned something tonight, if Bessie's story moved you or made you angry or made you think, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about women history tried to bury. And let me know in the comments, what other forgotten women should we talk about? Whose stories need to be told? Because there are so many women like Bessie, women who were used, discarded, forgotten, women whose names we don't even know, and they all deserve to be remembered. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for helping make sure women like Bessie Blount are never forgotten again. Sleep well. And remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell the story. Tonight we told Bessie's, and tomorrow we'll tell another forgotten woman's story. Because they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be remembered. And we're not going to let them be erased anymore. Good night.